Welcome back. For those of you who are new, my name is James and I run the Al-Maida Initiative, and for the last 10 years I've been getting Christians and Muslims together over food to have friendly but also honest conversations. I'm currently comparing Muslims to 3 biblical archetypes as a way of helping Christians think through how they interact with Muslims. Last week we talked about the Samaritans. Next week we're going to talk about the Romans. This week we're talking about archetype number 2, the Pharisees. If the Samaritans are our model of regular people at various levels of practice and piety who we happen to disagree with, the Pharisees are our examples of religious zealots. It's very important to understand that the word Pharisee does not signal someone's rank, but the kind of movement that they were a part of. People who took both written word and the oral traditions passed on by the Jewish community very seriously and were actively seeking to show their devotion to God in every aspect of their lives. You could recognize them by the way they dressed. The Pharisees arose in the Jewish world in response to what they saw as Judaism being compromised by Greek influence and innovation after a colonial occupation. They wanted to get back to the teaching of the scriptures and what they believed were the traditions of their righteous ancestors passed down orally. Likewise, the Salafi movement arose in the Muslim world to counter what they saw as foreign influence in the shadow of colonial occupation. Salafi Islam is a subset of Sunni Islam, which believes in cutting past the thousands of years of scholarly development which represents mainstream Sunni tradition, which Salafis refer to as innovation or bid'ah, and go back both to the Qur'an and the authentic traditions passed down from the first 3 generations of pious Muslims who were Muhammad's companions. Jesus' harshest words were always aimed at people who were convinced of their own innate righteousness, and the Pharisees were often his target. One of Jesus' central indictments against the religiously pious was that they pushed religious observance on everyone around them, but were not actually present to love and help those around them. In Matthew 23:4, he says, "They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats at the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others." Swap out the details for people who make their clothes loose and their beards long, who like to be addressed as Ya Sheikh, and suddenly this archetype will feel very familiar to many Muslims. But I don't want to give you the idea that Jesus is simply offering constructive criticism. He is repudiating the whole movement in the strongest possible terms. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." Jesus is not simply calling these people misguided, he is saying they represent what God himself hates. Believe it or not, many in the Muslim world feel the same way about the type of Muslims who are outwardly pious and constantly pushing strict religious adherence on everyone around them. In Saudi Arabia, there's a Najdi Arabic phrase which goes, "Put a religious scholar, matawa, between you and hell," implying the people who allegedly represent pious religious tradition are actually hypocrites destined for God's judgment. This is almost a parallel to Jesus saying, "Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven" in Matthew 5:20. But what is the core problem that Jesus is addressing with these kinds of people? "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guide, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel." These were people who were obsessed with religious minutiae while missing the substance of what God actually wanted for them. In 2002, there was a fire at an all-girls school in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. According to multiple Saudi sources, 15 girls died because religious police would not let them evacuate because they were not wearing their abayas to cover their whole bodies. The Saudi government denied this at the time, but many people believed it, either because it was true or because it perfectly aligned with their own experiences. A friend of mine from Dammam was driving back from Bahrain when someone hit her father's car and caused it to flip over. Her father got out and went to look for help, and as she managed to climb out of the car, the first people on the scene were the religious police. And their first question was not, "Are you okay?" but "Where is your male guardian?" Jesus describes them well. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So also you outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." I want to take a sidebar here to state clearly that these kinds of people don't represent all Muslims, and they no longer represent Saudi culture either. In 2017, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said, "We are simply reverting to what we followed, a moderate Islam open to the world and all religions. 70% of Saudis are younger than 30. Honestly, we won't waste 30 years of our life combating extremist thoughts. We'll destroy them now and immediately." And these are not empty words. Saudi Arabia no longer requires Saudi women to wear a hijab. They can travel without a male guardian and are now allowed to drive. When I went to Saudi Arabia, I was able to talk openly and respectfully about religious differences without feeling threatened or judged at any point. When the Jews at the time of Jesus heard Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees, when he ended the monopoly of their claim to righteousness, people were freed. People were full of joy, and the words of Jesus will resonate with just as many Muslims who have been crushed under the weight of religious scholars. While the Muslim world is changing rapidly, in almost every Muslim culture, it is these types of people who are driving the persecutions of Christians from Egypt to Afghanistan. In John 16, Jesus says, "They will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God." From everything we've covered so far, we see clearly that Jesus engages the Pharisees with boldness by open statement of the truth and is not afraid to be blunt. And this must be true of us as Christians as we engage with the types of Muslims who are a modern reflection of the Pharisees, no matter what the consequences are. On the flip side of this, not all interactions Jesus had with Pharisees were bad. Nicodemus, as mentioned in John 3, who came to Jesus by night, was a Pharisee. One of the most striking examples of a good Pharisee outlined in the Bible in Acts 5:34 is Gamaliel, who was not a Christian, but advised the Jews in Jerusalem to leave the Christians alone in case they were to be found to be opposing God. Therefore, we can expect to find religiously serious Muslims who, despite not being Christians, are nevertheless men and women of principle and moderation, who are not our inevitable enemies. If the Bible itself can speak honorably of religious leaders who are on the wrong side of truth, then we as Christians can also give honor where honor is due, as outlined in Romans 13:7. We are not compromising anything by admitting when a Muslim has done something well or contributing something good to the world. One might argue that the Jews in the first century are different than religious Muslims because they were at least heirs of a religion that it was true at its core, but they put too much weight on the traditions of their ancestors and the opinions of their leaders. In first century Judea, the Pharisees were thought of as the polar opposite of the Samaritans in everyone's perception, because the Samaritans represented mixing divine truth with human error, and the Pharisees prided themselves on being pure. However, Jesus accused them of doing the exact same thing the Pharisees were accusing the Samaritans of. You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. The problem with the Judaism of the Pharisees, according to Jesus, was that human tradition had become a barrier to them understanding the words of God, which ultimately led to them missing the point entirely. That didn't mean no virtue could ever come from them or their tradition. It was just not the kind of virtue that can justify them before God. In the same way, Islam affirms the Torah. It even affirms the gospel. But Christians would argue that the Muslim view, much like the Pharisees, has been distorted by reliance on what is ultimately human tradition. So while the working may look significantly different, the end result is essentially the same. The Jews who did not accept Jesus as a Messiah rejected him completely. Muslims may accept Jesus as an anachronistic figurehead of their own beliefs, but they reject his core message about himself. It's like somebody always praising their father publicly, but never listening to any of his advice in private. If we only look at the words of Jesus when interacting publicly with the Pharisees, it might be tempting to think of people in this category as a lost cause. But if we take the Bible holistically, we know that's not true. The obvious example here is Paul, who described himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. If God can turn the life of Paul around, then we can have hope that God can turn around even the most zealous religious opponents of Christianity and turn them into future brothers, as Paul himself says. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Come back next week, and we're going to talk about how Muslims fit in with the Romans.